What if the most powerful weapons in history weren't swords or cannons, but stories? Think about it. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen, not because of battles, but because of the tales they believed. Take King Arthur's Excalibur, a sword so legendary it wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of divine right, a story that convinced thousands to follow a leader they believed was chosen by fate. Or consider the Trojan Horse, a simple wooden structure that became the ultimate deception, ending a decade-long war without a single clash of steel. These weren't just myths, they were carefully crafted narratives, tools sharper than any blade, designed to bend reality itself. This is the untold story of weaponized legends, myths so potent they rewrote history without shedding a drop of blood. Across centuries, rulers, priests, and even entire cultures have wielded stories like invisible armies, using them to justify power, erase inconvenient truths, or unite people under a shared belief. Some legends were spun to inspire, others to control, but all of them shared one thing in common. They changed the world not through force, but through the sheer power of persuasion. And here's the twist: many of these stories are so deeply embedded in our history books, our traditions, even our modern politics, that we rarely stop to question where they came from or why they were created in the first place. Over the next 20 revelations, we'll unravel these hidden threads, pulling back the curtain on the legends that shaped empires, toppled kings, and even altered the course of science and religion. From the whispered prophecies that launched crusades to the fabricated heroes used to forge national identities, each of these tales holds a secret, a deliberate twist of truth designed to serve someone's agenda. So if you've ever wondered why some stories feel too perfect, too convenient, or too timeless to be accidental, you're about to discover the unsettling answer. This isn't just a journey through myth and folklore. It's a detective story, one where the clues are hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to connect the dots. Ready to see history in a whole new light? Let's begin. A weaponized legend isn't just a story, it's a carefully crafted tool, sharpened over generations to cut straight into the heart of what people believe. Unlike brute force, which demands obedience through fear, these myths work silently, weaving themselves into culture, religion, and even memory until they feel like undeniable truths. Take the idea of divine right, spun by kings and pharaohs who claimed their power came directly from the gods. It wasn't enough to rule, they had to make their authority feel inevitable, as natural as the rising sun. And it worked. For centuries, people accepted inequality, war, and even oppression because the stories they were told made those injustices seem like part of a grand, unchangeable design. But why are legends so much more powerful than swords or laws? The answer lies in something called soft power, the ability to influence not by coercion, but by shaping desires and beliefs. Think of it like this: a conqueror can take a city by force, but it's the stories they tell afterward that determine whether the people there will resist or embrace their new rulers. Ancient Rome knew this well. After crushing rebellions, they didn't just leave garrisons behind. They built temples, rewrote local myths to include Roman gods, and even absorbed foreign heroes into their own legends. Over time, conquered people began to see themselves as part of Rome's story, not its victims. This psychological grip is what makes weaponized myth so dangerous and so effective. They don't just justify power, they erase alternatives. When a society believes its founding heroes were chosen by the gods or that its enemies are inherently evil, it stops questioning the system. Look at how national identities are built. The tale of George Washington and the cherry tree, for instance, wasn't just a cute anecdote. It was a deliberate lesson in honesty, meant to shape how Americans viewed leadership. Never mind that the story was likely invented decades after Washington's death. What mattered was the moral it carried, the ideal it embedded in generations of citizens. And this manipulation isn't confined to ancient history or dusty textbooks. Modern propaganda, from wartime posters to viral social media narratives, operates on the same principles. The difference: today's myths are engineered at lightning speed, tailored to exploit our deepest fears and desires. Yet the goal remains unchanged: to make us believe, to make us obey, without ever realizing we've been persuaded. So which story was the first to rewrite history? That honor might belong to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a 4,000-year-old tale that transformed a likely real king into a demigod, blending fact and fiction so seamlessly that the legend outlived the civilization that created it. But Gilgamesh was just the beginning. From there, the art of weaponized storytelling only grew sharper, more calculated, and far more influential than any army could ever be. Long before crowns and scepters, rulers understood that the surest way to hold power wasn't just by commanding armies, but by controlling the story of where that power came from. The divine right of kings didn't spring up overnight. Its roots stretch back to the dawn of civilization itself. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers like Sargon of Akkad didn't just call themselves kings, they claimed to be the literal offspring of gods, their bloodlines threaded with divine favor. Over in Egypt, pharaohs weren't merely political leaders, they were living embodiments of Horus, walking among mortals with a mandate from the cosmos. This wasn't just grandiosity, it was psychological warfare. If your king wasn't just a man but a vessel of the gods, questioning him wasn't just treason, it was sacrilege. The genius of this legend was its circular logic. By claiming authority came from the heavens, rulers made dissent impossible to justify. After all, how could a peasant argue with the will of the gods? This myth became a self-reinforcing trap. The more people believed in divine right, the harder it was to challenge, and the more entrenched it grew. Take King James I of England, who didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited a narrative. When critics questioned his policies, he didn't bother with debates. He simply pointed to scripture, quoting passages that framed kings as God's lieutenants on earth. Rebellion wasn't just unlawful, it was a sin against the divine order itself. But here's what makes this legend so insidious: it didn't just justify power, it erased alternatives. For centuries, the idea of democracy or shared rule seemed not just impractical but unnatural, a rebellion against the very fabric of the universe. Imagine how history might have unfolded if this story hadn't taken such deep root. Would the Magna Carta have happened earlier? Would revolutions have sparked sooner? The divine right myth didn't just delay progress, it reshaped humanity's imagination, making the idea of equality seem impossible until brave thinkers finally dared to tell a new story. And yet, traces of this ancient tactic linger today. Whenever leaders frame their authority as inevitable, unquestionable, or tied to some higher purpose, they're borrowing from the same playbook. The names and contexts change, but the strategy remains. Wrap power in a story so compelling that challenging it feels like fighting fate itself. The Trojan Horse wasn't just a clever wartime trick, it was the ultimate blueprint for psychological warfare, a story so potent that its name still sends shivers down spines 3,000 years later. According to legend, after a decade of failed attacks on Troy, the Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving behind a massive wooden horse as a supposed peace offering. The Trojans, believing it was a tribute to the gods, wheeled it inside their impenetrable walls only to discover too late that it was packed with enemy soldiers who crept out under cover of night to open the gates. But here's the unsettling question: did this even happen? Historians still debate whether the Trojan horse was real, a poetic exaggeration, or pure myth. Yet its power lies not in its historical truth, but in its enduring symbolism, the perfect metaphor for deception hiding in plain sight. What makes this legend so chilling is how effortlessly it crossed the line from myth to military doctrine. During World War II, Allied forces dubbed covert operations Trojan Horse missions, dropping spies behind enemy lines disguised as civilians or even enemy soldiers. The Nazis, too, weaponized the idea, hiding explosives in everyday objects like wine bottles and coal sacks. The lesson was clear: the most dangerous threats often come wrapped in familiarity. Fast forward to today, and the Trojan horse lives on in our digital world. Computer viruses named Trojans mimic the ancient ruse, sneaking malicious code into systems disguised as harmless files or software updates. Click on the wrong email attachment, and you've unknowingly welcomed the enemy inside your fortress, just like the Trojans did. But the most insidious modern Trojan horses aren't just digital, they're ideological. Think of viral conspiracy theories packaged as hidden truths, or political propaganda disguised as grassroots movements. They exploit trust, using the language of community or concern to mask their real agendas. Even advertising leans on this tactic, wrapping products in narratives of empowerment or nostalgia to bypass our skepticism. The genius and the horror of the Trojan horse is that it preys on our willingness to believe, to let down our guard when something feels familiar or flattering. So what's the takeaway? The Trojan horse legend endures because it taps into a timeless fear that the greatest dangers don't storm our gates, they're invited in, applauded, even celebrated before revealing their true nature. Whether in ancient Troy, wartime Europe, or today's hyper-connected world, the lesson remains the same. Trust isn't just a virtue, it's a vulnerability, one that can be exploited by anyone who knows how to dress destruction up as a gift. Every empire begins with a story, but few are as brutal or as telling as the tale of Romulus and Remus. According to legend, the twin brothers were abandoned as infants, left to die by the Tiber River, only to be saved by a she-wolf who nursed them back to health. Raised by shepherds, they grew up to found a city until a bitter dispute over its location led Romulus to kill his own brother, becoming Rome's first king and namesake. On the surface, it's a story of survival and destiny, but dig deeper and you'll find something far darker, a founding myth drenched in blood, one that didn't just explain Rome's origins, it foreshadowed its ruthless soul. What's chilling about this legend isn't just the violence, it's the way Rome embraced it. Unlike other cultures that softened their origin stories, Romans proudly wielded fratricide as a badge of honor. Romulus didn't just win power, he seized it through betrayal, setting a precedent for centuries of political backstabbing, from Caesar's assassination to the endless purges of emperors. The message was clear: greatness demanded sacrifice, even if that sacrifice was your own flesh and blood. And when Augustus rose to power after Rome's civil wars, he didn't shy away from the parallel. He revived the myth, linking himself to Romulus, framing his own rise built on the ashes of his rivals, as a divine repetition of history. But Rome wasn't alone in polishing a violent past into a shining legend. Compare Romulus and Remus to America's cherry tree fable, where young George Washington supposedly confessed to chopping down his father's tree, enshrining honesty as a national virtue. One story glorifies ruthless ambition, the other moral integrity. both were carefully curated to shape how people saw their leaders and themselves. The difference. Rome's myth didn't just justify authority, it normalized brutality as the price of power. So here's the uncomfortable question. If a nation's founding story can justify conquest, can it also plant the seeds of its downfall? Rome's mythos of relentless expansion and internal betrayal didn't just inspire its rise, it scripted its collapse. When later emperors embraced Romulus's example too literally, murdering rivals without restraint, they turned the empire's strength into a fatal weakness. The same stories that once united citizens under a shared destiny eventually fueled paranoia and decay. That's the double-edged sword of weaponized legends. They don't just build nations, they trap them in cycles, repeating the same patterns until the very myths that created greatness become the blueprint for disaster. And if that sounds ancient, consider how modern nations still cling to origin stories, romanticizing revolution, manifest destiny, or exceptionalism without asking what those narratives might justify or what they might cost. The Holy Grail wasn't always the glittering, sacred object we imagine. In fact, its earliest mentions barely described it at all. The legend we know today was hammered into shape by medieval rulers who saw its power not as a spiritual quest, but as a weapon to mobilize armies. In Chrétien de Troyes' 12th century tales, the Grail was just a mysterious dish, a fleeting symbol in Arthur's court. But within decades, it transformed into the ultimate religious relic, the cup of Christ, said to have caught his blood at the crucifixion. That shift wasn't accidental. As the Crusades raged, European kings and clerics needed a story potent enough to justify sending thousands to die in distant deserts. What better rallying cry than a holy treasure, waiting to be reclaimed from the infidels? Enter relics like the Chalice of Valencia, a goblet enshrined in Spain and declared by the faithful to be the true Grail. Never mind that historians trace its origins to the Middle Ages, not biblical times. What mattered was the fervor it inspired. Pilgrims flocked, donations poured in, and knights marched east, convinced that reclaiming such artifacts would purify their souls and secure divine favor. The Grail became more than a cup. It was a recruiting tool, a spiritual blank check for conquest, and the Church, it reaped the benefits, tightening its grip on both faith and politics by controlling the narrative of sacred discovery. But the Grail's dark irony lies in how easily its purity was corrupted. While monks whispered of its power to heal and enlighten, kings like Richard the Lionheart used the legend to fund wars, promising glory to those who fought under its banner. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the pattern repeats, this time with Nazis scouring Europe for the Grail, convinced it held supernatural power to fuel their reign. Heinrich Himmler's occult-obsessed SS even sent expeditions to Spanish monasteries, blending medieval myth with racist ideology. The Grail, once a symbol of divine grace, had become a trophy for tyrants. So why does this myth still captivate us? Look at modern treasure hunters, conspiracy theorists, even blockbuster films still chasing the Grail's promise. It taps into something primal, the idea that a single object could hold ultimate truth, power, or redemption. But the real lesson isn't about finding the Grail, it's about who gets to define it. Every era molds the legend to fit its obsessions, from holy wars to white supremacist fantasies. The cup itself may be fictional, but the hunger it represents, the desire to possess something that makes us chosen, special, invincible. That's as real as it gets. And as long as that hunger exists, the Grail will keep finding new hands to wield it. El Dorado wasn't just a legend, it was a death warrant for entire civilizations. The myth of a golden city hidden deep in the Americas began as a whisper among Spanish conquistadors, a tale of a king so rich he coated himself in gold dust during sacred ceremonies. But by the time it reached the ears of men like Francisco Pizarro, it had morphed into something far more dangerous, a justification for genocide. Armed with this story, Pizarro and his men carved a path of destruction through the Inca Empire, not just seizing gold but erasing cultures, burning temples, and rewriting history to frame their greed as a noble quest. The real tragedy: there was no El Dorado, just the shattered remains of societies that had dared to thrive without European interference. Yet the legend refused to die. Centuries later, English adventurers like Sir Walter Raleigh picked up the same thread, launching expeditions into the jungles of Guyana, convinced the Golden City still awaited discovery. Raleigh's obsession cost him his son's life and his own freedom, but the myth endured, feeding into a broader colonial delusion that the New World was a treasure chest ripe for the taking. This wasn't just exploration, it was extraction disguised as destiny. By the time the phrase "manifest destiny" echoed across North America, the pattern was set. The belief that divine providence had reserved untold riches for European settlers wasn't new. It was El Dorado rebranded, repackaged to justify westward expansion and the displacement of native peoples. Fast forward to the modern era, and the Golden City's shadow looms larger than ever. Think of the oil-rich utopias promised by politicians and corporations, visions of endless wealth buried beneath deserts or Arctic ice, just waiting for the right hands to unlock them. Or consider the tech industry's obsession with unicorn startups, mythical companies valued at billions before they've turned a profit. These are our El Dorados, glittering mirages that justify reckless exploitation in the name of progress. The players have changed, but the game remains the same. Stoke desire, blur the line between myth and reality, and let the desperate rush in to do the dirty work. So here's the uncomfortable question. What happens when the treasure isn't gold or oil, but data, clean energy, or even artificial intelligence? The next El Dorado might not be a place at all. It could be an algorithm, a patent, or a viral idea. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the most dangerous myths aren't the ones we dismiss, but the ones we're still willing to kill for. The Philosopher's Stone wasn't just a myth, it was the ultimate alchemical con, a promise so seductive it fooled kings, scientists, and even geniuses like Isaac Newton. Legends claimed this elusive substance could turn lead into gold, heal any wound, and grant eternal life. But behind the mystical allure lay a darker truth. The stone was less about enlightenment and more about control. European monarchs poured fortunes into alchemy, funding secret labs and imprisoning chemists who failed to deliver. For rulers like Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, the stone wasn't just a fantasy, it was a financial strategy, a desperate bid to refill empty coffers drained by endless wars. And when alchemists couldn't produce results, they were executed for fraud, their deaths a grim reminder of what happened when myths collided with reality. Newton's obsession with the stone reveals how deeply these legends could corrupt even the brightest minds. While revolutionizing physics and mathematics, he spent decades scribbling cryptic notes on alchemy, convinced the stone's secrets were just one experiment away. His fixation wasn't unique. Early science was steeped in alchemy, blurring the line between rigorous inquiry and mystical pursuit. The irony: Newton's quest for transformation did change the world, just not in the way he expected. His meticulous alchemical records, though flawed, laid groundwork for modern chemistry, proving that even the wildest myths could accidentally spark progress. Yet for every Newton, there were 100 charlatans. Medieval Europe teemed with con artists selling authentic philosopher's stones to gullible nobles. One notorious fraudster, Edward Kelly, convinced patrons he could summon angels to reveal the stone's formula, all while pocketing their gold. sound familiar. Fast forward to today, and the same tactics resurface in pyramid schemes, cryptocurrency hype, and miracle cures. The packaging changes, but the pitch remains identical: infinite wealth, effortless transformation, and a shortcut to power. So why do these myths persist? Because they prey on our deepest vulnerabilities: the fear of death, the hunger for wealth, the longing for a single solution to life's chaos. The philosopher's stone didn't vanish with the alchemists, it just shape-shifted. Now it's a viral stock tip, a detox tea, or a Silicon Valley guru promising to disrupt mortality itself. The lesson isn't that we're gullible, it's that power will always exploit hope, dressing desperation up as destiny. And when the myth fails, history shows us the fallout: broken trust, emptied treasuries, and the chilling realization that some promises were never meant to be kept. The legend of the lost tribe of Israel didn't just wander through history, it was weaponized, reshaped into a tool to justify conquest and erase entire cultures. European colonizers, from the British in Africa to Mormon settlers in America, latched onto the idea that indigenous peoples were descendants of these ancient Israelites, spinning a narrative that served one brutal purpose: to frame invasion as destiny. In southern Africa, British missionaries preached that the Zulu and Xhosa were lost tribes, their discovery by white settlers not an act of violence but a divine reunion. This wasn't just misguided theology, it was a calculated move. If native populations could be tied to a biblical past, their land could be taken under the guise of religious salvation, their resistance painted as a betrayal of their own supposed heritage. Mormon settlers took the myth even further, weaving it into their doctrine. The Book of Mormon claimed Native Americans were descended from a lost Israelite family, their fallen state justifying conversion and displacement. Never mind that genetic evidence and indigenous oral histories completely contradicted this. The story wasn't about truth. It was about power. By framing colonization as a spiritual duty, settlers could paint themselves not as invaders but as benevolent guides, leading their long-lost brethren back to God. The racism here is glaring. Indigenous peoples were cast as wayward children, incapable of self-governance until white saviors arrived to reclaim them for scripture. This pattern isn't unique. From the Aryan homeland, myths used to justify Nazi expansion to the pseudoscientific theories that labeled ancient African ruins as the work of lost white civilizations. These narratives all share a common thread. They erase indigenous agency, replacing real history with fantasies that center the conqueror. When British colonizers declared Great Zimbabwe couldn't have been built by Africans, or when early archaeologists insisted the Olmec heads of Mexico must have been carved by outsiders, they weren't just wrong, they were actively rewriting the past to serve the present. So who benefits from these lost tribe legends? Always the same groups, those in power. By tying indigenous peoples to a mythical past, colonizers could justify stripping their land, culture, and autonomy, all while casting themselves as the heroes of the story. Even today, these myths linger in conspiracy theories and fringe movements, their toxic legacy still shaping how some view the world. The real tragedy isn't that these stories were believed, it's that they were designed to be believed, crafted to make oppression look like fate. And once a lie that big takes root, untangling it takes more than facts, it takes the courage to ask whose truth we've been told, and whose we've been taught to ignore. Prester John wasn't just a myth, he was a geopolitical weapon, a phantom king conjured to shift the balance of power in medieval Europe. The legend first surfaced in the 12th century, a letter allegedly from this mysterious Christian ruler describing a kingdom overflowing with gold, unicorns, and an army ready to crush Islam from the east. Overnight, Prester John became the ultimate propaganda tool, crusading armies battered by defeats in the Holy Land, clung to the idea that a mighty Christian ally was out there, poised to strike the Muslim world from the rear. The Vatican eagerly amplified the story, using it to rally support for failing campaigns. Never mind that no one had ever seen this kingdom. The mere possibility was enough to keep hope and funding flowing. But the real genius of the Prester John myth was its adaptability. When Mongol invaders stormed into Europe, some clerics quickly recast them as Prester John's forces until it became clear they were anything but Christian. Undeterred, the legend simply shifted continents. By the age of exploration, Portuguese explorers were scouring Africa, convinced Prester John ruled a hidden empire somewhere in Ethiopia or the Congo. King Joao II even sent spies to find him, armed with maps scribbled with hearsay and wishful thinking. Why? Because a Christian ally in Africa could justify colonialism as a holy mission, turning exploitation into evangelism. The myth proved so useful that even when Portuguese diplomats met the real Ethiopian emperor, they twisted his faith to fit their narrative, ignoring centuries of local tradition to declare him Prester John's descendant. Fast forward to today, and the pattern feels eerily familiar. Whether it's conspiracy theories about a secret savior poised to cleanse governments or politicians framed as messianic figures, the hunger for a Prester John never really faded. These modern myths tap into the same desperate hope that someone, somewhere holds the power to fix everything if only we can find them, but history's lesson is stark. Phantom saviors don't rescue us. They're distractions, stories spun to keep us chasing shadows while real power goes unchallenged. So why do we keep inventing them? Maybe because it's easier to believe in a hero than to face the messy truth. That change rarely comes from above, but from the collective will of ordinary people refusing to wait for a king who never arrives. The Fountain of Youth wasn't just a fairy tale, it was a smokescreen for empire. When Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon set sail for Florida in 1513, he wasn't chasing some whimsical myth, he was following orders. Crown needed new lands to plunder, and what better cover story than a magical spring that could turn back time? The legend gave Conquest a veneer of wonder, framing brutal colonization as a noble quest for eternal life. Never mind that historians doubt Ponce de Leon ever actually searched for the fountain. The story stuck because it was useful. It transformed greed into adventure, making the exploitation of indigenous peoples and lands seem almost romantic. But the myth's real power lies in its durability. Fast forward 5 centuries, and the Fountain of Youth hasn't dried up, it's just rebranded. Today's tech billionaires pour millions into longevity startups, hunting for genetic tweaks or AI-driven cures to solve aging. Silicon Valley's obsession with immortality mirrors Ponce de Leon's folly, right down to the unchecked arrogance. When PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel invests in parabiosis, infusing himself with young people's blood, or when biohackers tout unproven, age-reversing supplements, they're peddling the same old fantasy. The packaging is sleeker, the jargon more scientific, but the core promise hasn't changed: cheat death and do it at any cost. And like the Spanish crown, modern elites aren't just chasing youth for themselves, they're selling it. The global anti-aging industry, worth hundreds of billions, thrives on the same fears Ponce de Leon's sponsors exploited. Scroll through social media, and you'll find influencers hawking everything from stem cell facials to unregulated vampire therapies, all cloaked in the language of empowerment. The irony, many of these treatments are as mythical as the original fountain, backed by little more than testimonials and wishful thinking, yet people still gamble their savings and sometimes their health on the chance to turn back the clock. The darkest parallel, though, isn't the scams, it's the collateral damage. Just as Ponce de Leon's missions ravaged indigenous communities, today's longevity gold rush has casualties. Poor nations face biopiracy, where Western companies patent local genetic resources, turning traditional knowledge into profit. Ecuador's centenarian villagers, for example, have had their DNA mined by researchers seeking longevity genes, often with little benefit returning to their communities. Meanwhile, the wealthy hoard life-extending tech, widening the gap between those who can afford eternity and those who can't. So here's the haunting question: what's our Florida? What modern obsession are we willing to sacrifice ethics, equity, or even lives for? Crypto fortunes. AI supremacy, the next big cure. The fountain of youth was never really about water. It was about power, about who gets to decide who lives, who thrives, and who gets left behind. And until we confront that, we're all just repeating Ponce de Leon's mistake, mistaking conquest for discovery and desperation for hope. The Roswell incident didn't start as a UFO legend. It began as a weather balloon. At least that's what the U.S. military claimed when debris crashed on a New Mexico ranch in 1947. But within decades, that mundane explanation mutated into one of history's most enduring conspiracy theories: a crashed alien spacecraft hidden by the government to conceal extraterrestrial contact. What few realize is how deliberately this myth was nurtured, not by truth seekers, but by Cold War operatives who saw UFO hysteria as the perfect smokescreen. While amateur sleuths scoured the desert for alien fragments, the real secret wasn't little green men. It was cutting-edge spy planes like the U-2 and stealth technology the U.S. needed to keep hidden from Soviet eyes. The genius of the Roswell myth was its misdirection. Let the public chase flying saucers, the thinking went, and they'd never ask about the black projects happening right under their noses. This wasn't just passive deception, it was psychological warfare. Declassified documents reveal how intelligence agencies like the CIA actively stoked UFO speculation to muddy the waters. In the 1950s, they funded dubious research groups, leaked fake sightings to tabloids, and even encouraged Hollywood to produce alien invasion films. The goal: to make any discussion of unexplained aircraft seem laughable, ensuring real classified programs stayed buried under layers of absurdity. The tactic worked brilliantly. When pilots reported strange objects moving at impossible speeds, officials just shrugged and said, "Must be another flying saucer." Skepticism became the default, and legitimate questions about government secrecy were drowned out by wild tales of alien autopsies. Fast forward to today, and the Roswell playbook is still in use. Just swap aliens for QAnon or deep state fantasies. Modern conspiracy theories thrive on the same ingredients: a kernel of real secrecy. Think covert drone strikes or data surveillance wrapped in layers of exaggeration and myth. The result: a public so exhausted by outlandish claims that they stop questioning power altogether. Why bother digging into Pentagon budgets when you're busy debating reptilian overlords? But here's the haunting question Roswell forces us to confront. Why are we so eager to believe in cover-ups? Perhaps because the truth is often more unsettling than fiction. It's easier to blame shadowy aliens than admit our governments lie to us about mundane horrors like failed weapons tests or illegal surveillance. Or maybe it's simpler to imagine a world where someone, even extraterrestrials, is in control, rather than face the chaos of real history. Whatever the reason, Roswell taught those in power a dangerous lesson. Give people a myth to chase, and they'll ignore the secrets hiding in broad daylight. And as long as we keep taking the bait, the real cover-ups won't need a tinfoil hat, just our willingness to look the other way. The so-called curse of the Pharaohs wasn't whispered in ancient tombs, it was invented in newspaper headlines. When Howard Carter's team opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, British media spun a tale of supernatural vengeance, claiming inscriptions warned that death shall come on swift wings to those who disturb the pharaoh's rest. Never mind that no such inscription existed in Tut's tomb or any other. The myth exploded after Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's financier, died months later from an infected mosquito bite. Never mind that Carter, who actually entered the tomb first, lived another 16 years. The curse had one purpose: to paint Egypt as a land of exotic danger, where Western explorers braved supernatural forces to rescue history from the sands. This wasn't just tabloid fodder, it was colonial propaganda. By framing Egyptian relics as cursed, Western collectors could justify looting them. If artifacts were shrouded in malevolent magic, weren't they safer in British museums under the protective care of white scholars? The pattern repeats in other cursed treasure myths. The Hope Diamond's alleged misfortunes distracted from France's plunder of Indian jewels, while rumors of a mummy's curse at London's British Museum drew crowds away from asking how it got there. The real curse wasn't magic, it was the erasure of how these treasures were taken, often at gunpoint, from cultures dismissed as too backward to preserve their own heritage. But the darkest irony lies in who was truly cursed. While Western media obsessed over Tutankhamun's vengeance, Egypt's own archaeologists like Zahi Hawass pointed out the real victims, the millions of ordinary Egyptians whose history was mined for foreign entertainment. Their tombs were emptied, their ancestors' bodies displayed as curiosities, their narratives were written to fit colonial fantasies. Compare this to Greece's Elgin marbles or Nigeria's Benin bronzes. Looted artifacts still held abroad under the guise of preservation, while their source nations fight for their return. The pharaoh's curse, then, was never about magic. It was about power. It asked audiences to fear a mummy's wrath, but never question why his gold wound up in a London gallery. So here's the uncomfortable question the curse myth forces us to confront. Who cursed whom? Was it the ancients whose rest was violated, or the living, whose history was stripped away and sold as spectacle? When we marvel at Tutankhamun's mask today, we're not just looking at art. We're seeing the fingerprints of an industry that turned sacred objects into trophies and conquest into a bedtime story. The real curse isn't in the tombs, it's in the way we've been taught to see them. The Pied Piper of Hamelin seems like a simple children's fable, a mysterious piper luring rats, then children, away with his flute. But peel back the layers and you'll find a darker truth. This story was never just about rats or music. It was a weapon used to stoke fear and point fingers at society's most vulnerable. The earliest versions of the tale emerged in medieval Europe, a time when plague and famine left people desperate for someone to blame, and who better to target than the outsiders, the ones who didn't fit in. By the 1300s, the piper's story had taken on a sinister twist in some regions, with whispers that he wasn't just a stranger, he was a Jew luring Christian children to their doom. Never mind that there's zero historical evidence linking Jewish communities to any mass disappearance in Hamelin. The legend wasn't about facts, it was about fear, a way to justify persecution under the guise of protecting the innocent. This wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe, similar stories cropped up, blood libels accusing Jewish communities of kidnapping children, poisoning wells, or practicing dark magic. These myths weren't just folktales, they were psychological triggers designed to turn neighbors against each other. When crops failed or disease spread, it was easier to blame a scapegoat than confront complex truths like poor sanitation or feudal exploitation. Pied Piper became a placeholder for society's anxieties, his flute a metaphor for the siren song of the other, leading good people astray, and the consequences were horrifyingly real. Pogroms, expulsions, and mass burnings often followed these rumors, fueled by the same narrative logic. If disaster struck, someone must have orchestrated it. Fast forward to today, and the piper's melody hasn't faded. It's just changed key. During the COVID pandemic, conspiracy theories blamed marginalized groups for the virus's spread, from anti-Asian rhetoric to claims that migrants were super spreaders. Politicians and pundits still play the piper's tune, pointing fingers at refugees, activists, or political opponents whenever crises hit. The mechanism is identical. Identify a villain, tie them to society's ills, and watch as fear does the rest. Even the imagery sticks. Modern pipers might not carry flutes, but they wield social media algorithms, viral misinformation, and us versus them rhetoric with the same hypnotic effect. So who are today's pipers? Look for the voices that promise simple answers to messy problems. The ones who insist that this group, this ideology, is the root of all suffering. The real danger isn't the flute. It's the willingness to believe that complex tragedies have cartoonish villains, because history shows us the cost of that belief. When we follow the piper, we're not just walking away from rats. We're marching toward something far worse. The Wandering Jew might sound like just another medieval legend, but this story carried a poison that seeped through centuries. The myth began as a Christian folktale, a shoemaker who supposedly taunted Jesus on the way to the crucifixion, cursed to walk the earth until Judgment Day as punishment. But what started as religious cautionary tale twisted into something far darker. By the Middle Ages, the Wandering Jew had become a symbol used to justify violence, his eternal punishment recast as proof of Jewish collective guilt for Christ's death. Crusaders invoked the legend while massacring Jewish communities across Europe, framing their atrocities as divine justice. The pattern repeated in city after city. When famine or plague struck, mobs would turn on their Jewish neighbors, citing this mythical wanderer as evidence of some inherent corruption. Never mind that actual Jewish diaspora history tells a radically different story, one of forced exiles, resilient cultures, and intellectual contributions from medicine to philosophy. The myth wasn't about truth, it was a license to hate. Nazi propagandists weaponized this legend with chilling precision. Joseph Goebbels' ministry circulated pamphlets depicting the Wandering Jew as a hook-nosed parasite, infecting nations with greed and decay. School children were taught that Jews, like the mythical wanderer, had no homeland because they were rootless by nature, a lie that paved the way for ghettos and death camps. The irony, while the Nazis painted Jews as eternal outsiders, they themselves were stealing Jewish homes, businesses, and even names to fuel their war machine. The real wandering wasn't some ancient curse, it was the forced marches to concentration camps, the desperate flights of refugees turned away at borders. But here's what makes this myth so insidious. It flips reality on its head. Jewish history isn't a story of aimlessness, it's a tapestry of adaptation. From the golden age of Spanish Jewry to the vibrant communities of pre-war Eastern Europe. The legend erases all that, replacing real people with a boogeyman, and it's not confined to the past. Modern conspiracy theories still recycle this trope, from whispers about globalist elites to extremist manifestos ranting about rootless cosmopolitans. The language dresses itself in new terms, but the core lie remains unchanged, that some groups don't belong anywhere and therefore deserve nothing. So how does a story turn people into monsters? The same way it always has, by stripping away complexity until only a caricature remains. The Wandering Jew wasn't just a fictional character, he was a blank screen where societies projected their fears. And that's the danger we still face today. When myths harden into unquestioned truths, they don't just distort history, they shape the future. The next time you hear a story about those people, ask yourself whose voice is really telling it. And more importantly, who stands to gain if you believe it. The white man's burden wasn't just a poem, it was a moral alibi for empire. When Rudyard Kipling penned those infamous lines in 1899, urging America to take up the burden of civilizing the Philippines, he wasn't offering advice, he was writing a script for conquest. The idea was simple yet devastating: frame colonialism as a selfless duty, a charitable mission to uplift so-called half-devil and half-child races. Overnight, exploitation became enlightenment. British officials in India used it to justify stripping local textiles, once the envy of the world, and replacing them with Manchester factories. Belgian King Leopold wielded it to mask the horrors of the Congo, where millions perished under rubber quotas while he posed as a benevolent reformer. The genius of this myth wasn't its cruelty, it was its audacity. By painting oppression as philanthropy, empires could plunder with clean consciences, convinced they were doing God's work. But the real tragedy lies in how eagerly colonized peoples were erased from their own stories. Take the Philippines. After seizing the islands from Spain, the U.S. spent years crushing Filipino independence movements, all while insisting it was preparing them for democracy. Schools taught English instead of Tagalog, while American textbooks portrayed Filipinos as backward children in need of guidance. Meanwhile, in India, the British dismantled ancient universities, replacing them with systems designed to produce clerks, not leaders, a process Macaulay openly called creating a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste. The message was clear: your past is worthless, your future belongs to us. Fast forward to today, and the myth hasn't faded, it's just rebranded. Modern humanitarian interventions often follow the same blueprint: invade a nation under the banner of liberation, then impose economic policies that favor foreign corporations over local need. The Iraq War wasn't sold as an oil grab, but as a mission to spread democracy. NGOs sometimes echo colonial logic, flooding communities with Western solutions while ignoring indigenous knowledge. Even well-intentioned aid can backfire, like when donated clothes bankrupt African tailors or free rice undercuts local farmers. The question isn't whether help is needed, it's who defines what help looks like and who benefits when the dust settles. So where's the line between assistance and arrogance? Look for the red flags: when progress demands erasing culture, when development only flows one way, or when the helpers refuse to listen. The white man's burden didn't collapse because the world grew kinder. It crumbled because colonized nations fought back, reclaiming their right to write their own stories. Perhaps the real burden isn't on the giver, but on the receiver, forced to navigate the fine print of generosity that comes with strings attached. And that's the haunting legacy of Kipling's verse. It taught us that the most dangerous oppressors aren't those who admit their greed, but those who truly believe they're saviors. The noble savage wasn't just a stereotype, it was a weapon disguised as a compliment. When European explorers first wrote about indigenous peoples in the Americas and the Pacific, they didn't describe them as complex societies with their own laws, technologies, and histories. Instead, they framed them as innocent children of nature, living in perfect harmony with the land, untouched by civilization's corruption. On the surface, this might sound flattering, even reverent. But dig deeper, and you'll find the trap. By romanticizing indigenous cultures as pure and primitive, colonizers erased their agency, reducing them to symbols rather than recognizing them as sovereign nations capable of resistance, adaptation, or even diplomacy. The noble savage myth didn't celebrate indigenous people, it fossilized them, turning living, evolving cultures into static museum exhibits. This narrative didn't just live in books, it fueled real-world violence. When settlers wanted land, they pointed to the noble savage ideal to justify taking it. If indigenous peoples were truly one with nature, the logic went, they couldn't possibly own or develop the land like Europeans could. Thomas Jefferson used this twisted reasoning to claim Native Americans had no concept of property, despite ample evidence of sophisticated agriculture, trade networks, and territorial governance. Australia's terra nullius doctrine, the lie that the continent was empty before British arrival, relied on the same dehumanizing fantasy. By painting indigenous peoples as part of the landscape rather than its stewards, colonizers could dispossess them without guilt, framing theft as destiny. Fast forward to today, and the noble savage hasn't vanished, it's just shape-shifted. Modern, eco-native myths still reduce indigenous peoples to environmental mascots, as if their only value lies in being nature's caretakers. Corporations slap rainforested logos on products while ignoring indigenous land rights. Wellness gurus commodify smudging ceremonies or sweat lodges, stripping them of sacred context. Even well-meaning environmentalists sometimes treat indigenous knowledge as a monolith, as if every tribe shares the same relationship with nature. The irony is staggering. The same societies that once demonized indigenous peoples as savages now pedestal them as eco-sages. Yet both stereotypes deny them the right to be fully human, flawed, dynamic, and capable of self-determination. So why do we keep reducing people to symbols? Perhaps because symbols are easy. They don't demand justice, reparations, or the uncomfortable truth that thriving indigenous cultures were often dismantled by design. It's simpler to admire a romanticized past than to confront the messy present where indigenous activists fight pipelines, defend languages on the brink of extinction, or sue governments for broken treaties. The noble savage myth endures because it lets us off the hook, transforming historical crimes into aesthetic appreciation. But the truth is far more powerful. Indigenous peoples don't exist to teach us lessons or soothe our guilt. They're not relics, they're survivors, and their stories belong to them, not our fantasies. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion wasn't just a forgery, it was a blueprint for hatred, a lie so potent it outlived its creators and seeped into the bloodstream of history. Fabricated in the early 20th century by Tsarist Russia's secret police, the text claimed to expose a secret Jewish conspiracy to control the world through banks, media, and revolutions. Every word was fiction, but the damage was devastatingly real. From the moment it surfaced, the protocols became a weapon, wielded by those who needed a scapegoat for chaos, whether it was the fall of the Russian monarchy, economic collapse, or social unrest. The irony, the document itself was plagiarized from a French satire that had nothing to do with Jews, but facts didn't matter to those who craved someone to blame. Henry Ford, America's most famous industrialist, became one of its loudest propagandists. In the 1920s, he published 500,000 copies of the Protocols in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and even distributed them through Ford dealerships. His influence gave the lie legitimacy, embedding it in American culture at a time when anti-Semitism was already rising. Ford's obsession didn't stop at print. He funded schools promoting the myth and lobbied politicians to restrict Jewish immigration. By the time he reluctantly retracted his claims under legal pressure, the damage was done. The Protocols had crossed oceans, finding eager audiences in Europe, where a young Adolf Hitler cited them in Mein Kampf, calling them proof of a Jewish world plot. The rest is history, a history stained with genocide. Yet the most terrifying aspect of the Protocols isn't its past, but its present. Despite being debunked countless times by historians, courts, even the Nazis' own propagandists, it persists. Today, Hamas cites it in their founding charter. Conspiracy theorists recycle its tropes in viral posts about globalists or elites. modern autocrats invoke its imagery to justify crackdowns on dissent. The lie refuses to die because it's adaptable, morphing to fit new fears. In the 1920s, it was about Bolshevism. In the 21st century, it's about a deep state manipulation or cultural Marxism. The packaging changes, but the poison stays the same. So here's the chilling question. If a lie this blatant can endure for over a century, what other fictions are we still swallowing? The protocols teach us that disinformation isn't defeated by facts alone. It thrives where fear outweighs critical thought. And in an age of algorithms that reward outrage, the next great lie might not need a century to take root. It could be spreading right now, dressed as truth, waiting for its moment to rewrite history all over again. The idea that Greek civilization owes its roots to Africa isn't new, but few theories have ignited as much fire as Black Athena. First proposed by scholar Martin Bernal in the 1980s, this explosive work argued that ancient Greece's intellectual achievements, from philosophy to architecture, were deeply influenced by Egyptian and Phoenician cultures. Bernal claimed that Eurocentric scholars had systematically erased these connections, recasting Greece as the pure cradle of Europe rather than a crossroads of Afro-Asiatic ideas. Overnight, academia split into warring camps. Classicists accused Bernal of shoddy research, while Afrocentric scholars hailed Black Athena as long overdue justice for a stolen legacy. But beneath the scholarly skirmishes lay a bigger question: who gets to claim the past and why does it matter so much? The controversy wasn't just about ancient history, it was about modern identity. For Afrocentrists, Black Athena was a weapon against centuries of racist pseudoscience that had painted Africa as a continent without history. If Egypt birthed Greece and Greece birthed Europe, then Africa wasn't peripheral, it was foundational. This wasn't just academic, it was personal. From Harlem to Johannesburg, communities reclaiming African heritage used Bernal's work to challenge colonial education systems that had taught them their ancestors were savages. Meanwhile, Eurocentrists dug in, framing the theory as a threat to Western identity. Right-wing pundits warned of historical revisionism, as if acknowledging African influence would somehow unravel the Enlightenment. The irony, both sides were guilty of the same sin, treating history as a zero-sum game where crediting one culture meant diminishing another. But here's where Black Athena gets even thornier: its political afterlife. Leaders like Muammar Gaddafi and Louis Farrakhan weaponized the theory, using it to bolster Pan-African solidarity, or in some cases to fuel anti-Western resentment. Meanwhile, white supremacists twisted it into a straw man, claiming it proved multiculturalism was erasing European greatness. Lost in the noise were the nuances Bernal actually proposed, not that Greeks were black, but that Mediterranean cultures had always been interconnected, with ideas flowing freely across seas and deserts. The real tragedy of Black Athena isn't its inaccuracies, it's how its deepest insights were drowned out by the very identity politics it sought to critique. So can rewriting history ever be ethical? The answer lies in why we're rewriting it, correcting omissions, like restoring African contributions to the historical record isn't distortion, it's justice. But when history becomes a propaganda tool, whether for nationalism or grievance, it stops being about truth and starts being about power. The lesson of Black Athena isn't that we should replace one dogma with another. It's that history, at its best, is a conversation, one where every voice gets a seat at the table, and no civilization claims a monopoly on genius. The Mandela Effect isn't just about misremembering movie quotes, it's a window into how easily reality itself can be weaponized. When thousands of people swear they recall Nelson Mandela dying in prison during the 1980s, only to learn he was released and later became president, the confusion isn't just a quirk of memory. It's a symptom of something darker, a growing distrust in shared truth. The term, coined by paranormal researcher Fiona Broom, started as fringe speculation. But its rapid spread reveals how quickly skepticism can tip into paranoia, especially in an age where deepfakes and AI-generated content blur the line between fact and fiction. What begins as a fun debate over whether the Monopoly Man wears a monocle or if Star Wars C-3PO was gold or silver morphs into something more unsettling, a collective doubt that any memory, any fact can be trusted. Gaslighting, once a tool of abusive individuals, has scaled to societal levels. Imagine a world where politicians, corporations, or bad actors don't just manipulate facts, they rewrite the past itself. Deepfake technology already allows for eerily realistic videos of public figures saying things they never said. Combine that with the Mandela Effect's premise, and you have a recipe for chaos. During the 2020 US election, altered videos of candidates circulated, seeding doubt even after debunking. The danger isn't just fake content, it's the lingering suspicion that nothing is authentic, that every image, every memory might be part of an elaborate illusion. Once that seed is planted, even verified truths wither under scrutiny. But here's the twist. The Mandela Effect also exposes our need for consensus. Humans rely on shared reality to function. Trust in institutions, relationships, even personal identity crumbles when we can't agree on basic facts. Psychologists call this epistemic anxiety, the dread that our mental anchors might be fiction. And it's not just a modern phenomenon. History's greatest propagandists, from Stalin's airbrushed purges to Orwell's fictionalized Ministry of Truth, understood that controlling memory is the ultimate power. The difference now, you don't need a dictatorship to rewrite history, just a viral tweet or a clever algorithm. So where does that leave us? Perhaps the real lesson of the Mandela Effect isn't about false memories, it's about vulnerability. In a world where anyone with the right tools can fabricate proof, the only defense is a society that values critical thinking over sensationalism. The next time you second-guess a childhood memory or a news headline, ask yourself, is this a glitch in the matrix, or is someone counting on you to doubt everything? Because the scariest weapon isn't the lie itself, it's the fear that truth no longer exists. The war on Christmas didn't start with a battle, it started with a press release. In the early 2000s, conservative media outlets began amplifying a narrative that Christmas was under siege, claiming secular forces were waging a covert campaign to erase the holiday. Suddenly, innocuous acts like saying "Happy Holidays" became framed as acts of aggression, and store displays without nativity scenes were branded as evidence of a liberal plot. But here's the twist. This so-called war wasn't a grassroots uprising. It was a carefully engineered myth, one that served a far more practical purpose than protecting tinsel and carols. It was a fundraising goldmine, a polarization tactic, and above all, a distraction. Dig into the origins, and you'll find a pattern as predictable as holiday reruns. Talk radio hosts and cable news pundits stoked outrage over fabricated slights like the myth that schools were banning jingle bells for being racist, or that Starbucks minimalist cups were a deliberate snub to Christianity. These stories rarely held up under scrutiny, but they didn't need to. Their goal wasn't truth, it was engagement. Anger drives clicks, and clicks drive ad revenue. Political operatives quickly caught on, turning the "war on Christmas" into a rallying cry that galvanized base voters and funneled donations. By 2012, one prominent commentator was raising millions off the back of this imagined conflict, proving that nothing sells like a martyr complex, even if the martyrdom is purely fictional. But the real casualty here isn't Christmas, it's trust. When communities are pitted against each other over invented grievances, the damage lingers long after the tinsel is packed away. Studies show that exposure to culture war rhetoric doesn't just polarize, it erodes empathy, making people more likely to view those with differing beliefs as enemies rather than neighbors. And while pundits cash checks and politicians rally their bases, ordinary people are left navigating a world where holiday greetings are weaponized and office parties become ideological minefields. So who really wins the war on Christmas? Follow the money. Media conglomerates profit from outrage algorithms, political campaigns bank on division, and pundits build careers as self-appointed defenders of a holiday that was never in danger. Meanwhile, the actual spirit of the season, kindness, generosity, community, gets buried under a blizzard of performative outrage. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: the louder the war cries grew, the quieter the message of peace on earth became. And that's the hidden cost of weaponizing tradition, not just what we lose in the fight, but what we forget to celebrate along the way. The Great Replacement didn't start as a viral hashtag, it began as a footnote in a French far-right novel. In 1973, writer Jean Raspail spun a dystopian tale called The Camp of the Saints, depicting a world where non-white immigrants overrun Europe, toppling Western civilization. Though marketed as fiction, its themes seeped into political discourse, repackaged decades later by pundits like Renaud Camus, who coined the term Great Replacement. His claim that liberal elites were orchestrating a deliberate demographic shift, replacing white populations with immigrants to undermine national identity. On the surface, it might sound like another paranoid conspiracy, but when you trace its path from French salons to American manifestos, the damage becomes horrifyingly clear. This myth isn't just rhetoric, it's a rallying cry for violence, one that's left bloodstains from Christchurch to Pittsburgh. What makes the Great Replacement so dangerously sticky isn't its originality, it's its adaptability. Unlike older racist theories tied to biology, this one dresses itself in pseudo-academic language, pointing to birth rates and immigration statistics as proof of a plot. Far-right politicians like Marine Le Pen and Tucker Carlson didn't invent the idea, but they refined it, stripping away the overt bigotry to sell it as a concern about cultural preservation. The dog whistle is deliberate. By framing diversity as an existential threat, they turn policy debates into battles for survival. And when followers internalize that narrative, the leap to violence becomes terrifyingly short. The shooter who massacred worshippers at a New Zealand mosque in 2019 cited the Great Replacement in his manifesto. The gunman who targeted a Buffalo supermarket in 2022 echoed the same lie, believing he was saving his country from invasion. But here's the bitter irony: the Great Replacement myth reverses reality. Historically, population shifts have rarely been orchestrated by shadowy elites. They're driven by war, economic hardship, and climate crises, forces far bigger than any conspiracy. When Syrian refugees fled to Europe, it wasn't because of a plot, it was because their cities were reduced to rubble. When Central American migrants head north, it's not to replace anyone, it's to escape gang violence and starvation wages. The real replacement isn't happening to white populations. It's happening to truth itself, swapped out for a story that turns desperate people into pawns in someone else's narrative. So how do we disarm a myth this entrenched? Fact-checking alone won't work. Conspiracy theories thrive on emotion, not evidence. Maybe the answer lies in replacing fear with connection. After the Buffalo shooting, local black and white communities organized joint vigils, deliberately breaking the us versus them frame the killer believed in. In Germany, where far-right groups parrot replacement rhetoric, activists counter with living library projects where immigrants share their stories face to face with skeptics. These efforts don't just debunk lies, they rebuild the empathy that myths like this erode. Because the Great Replacement's ultimate goal isn't just to spread hate, it's to make solidarity impossible. And the best way to fight that isn't with arguments, but with the one thing conspiracy theories can't replicate: genuine human bonds. Stories don't just entertain, they conquer. Across 20 legends, we've seen myths wielded like scalpels, carving empires into existence, rewriting history without a single drop of blood spilled. From divine kings to cursed treasures, each tale reveals the same chilling truth: the most potent weapons aren't forged in steel, but in imagination. Power doesn't just demand obedience, it crafts a reality where obedience feels inevitable. Fear doesn't just control, it disguises itself as destiny and manipulation. It's at its deadliest when it convinces us we weren't manipulated at all. Think of the threads tying these legends together. The divine right of kings didn't just justify monarchy, it made inequality seem like divine order. The Holy Grail wasn't just a relic, it was a recruitment tool for holy wars. Even the War on Christmas, a modern myth, follows the same blueprint. Invent a threat, stoke outrage, and watch as divisions deepen while those in power profit. The patterns repeat because they work. Whether cloaked in medieval parchment or viral tweets, weaponized stories exploit our deepest needs: to belong, to understand, to believe in something bigger than ourselves. But here's the twist: recognizing these patterns is our greatest defense. Every time we question a too-perfect origin story, scrutinize a viral conspiracy, or challenge a narrative that pits us against them, we dull the edge of these invisible blades. History's greatest liberators weren't just warriors, they were storytellers who dared to rewrite the script. The Magna Carta, the Enlightenment, civil rights movements, all began with people rejecting the myths that bound them. So let's turn these lessons into action. Which of these 20 legends shocked you the most? Was it the way the protocols of the elders of Zion fueled genocide, or how the noble savage myth erased indigenous agency? Drop your thoughts below, because the best way to disarm a dangerous story is to expose it to daylight. And while we're at it, let's debunk today's myths together. Spot a viral lie, call it out. Hear a narrative that feels too convenient, dig deeper. As the old saying goes, the pen is mightier than the sword, but only if we wield it wisely. Because the stories we believe today will shape the world we inherit tomorrow, and that's no